Good day, my name is Helmich Varis and I'm a trainer of Eres Training Center International in Barneveld, the Netherlands. I have been presenting a PowerPoint on the first weeks of broiler management, and now I want to continue with the last week of broiler management. Obviously, I'll move my picture. Obviously, the birds you see here are not broilers, they are layers in an aviary system, which is most common in the Netherlands. But let me continue with broilers, of course. Now, in the fourth week, we are focusing on breathing. Of course, the previous weeks, what happened in the previous weeks is important now also, but especially in the fourth week, you may encounter problems, sometimes serious problems, as far as respiration is concerned. And that has to do, you have to realize that chickens, they don't sweat. So in order to get rid of extra heat, they can't sweat actually. So what they do is to access heat that is expelled by respiration, usually 60%, and that is they do that by, if they're going to do evaporation, then they are going to evaporate moisture from their body, and that is cool. That has a cooling effect. And then there is another 40% by radiation and contact with the environment. Now, depending whether it is 60 or 40% or 70-30 or 80-20, completely depends on the temperature, on the environment, climate, that is temperature and humidity. So what you'll see if a bird starts to suffer is you'll see that the beak is getting dirty. You see watery eyes or tear stripes also near the eyes, and you see panting. These are, and if indeed, if the situation gets worse, you might even get a red eye membrane. But by that time, you really have seen already that the birds are suffering. So basically, like I said, there are two kinds of ways for the chicken to get rid of extra heat. The normal way, what we call the sensible heat loss, that is effective when the temperature is less than 25 degrees, and that is by radiation or conducting and convection, the combination of the three. And then when the temperature reaches more than 25 degrees, then really evaporation becomes important. And if they have to lose a lot of heat by evaporation, you can imagine that this will give a lot of stress on the respiratory system also. So here you see that in the graph, you see up to 25 degrees, it is mainly the sensible heat loss that is most important. But after 25 degrees, you see that the evaporative the weight loss, heat loss is becoming more and more important, and in fact, it's going to be quite dominant. Now, a few respiratory problems which are caused, well, a few problems mentioned here is that you see an early infection, a runny nose, or an advanced or even a severe infection. And these infections might be simply infections of the respiratory system, but they may also be caused, a chicken might be more vulnerable for infections on the respiratory system if they have to use their respiratory system in order to lose heat. So if a chicken a broiler has energy intake, then about 1/4 of it is used for movement, growth, breathing, and maintaining the body temperature of about 41 degrees. But the far majority is expelled by means of heat. In other words, just digestion, to digest feed already requires a lot of heat production. So that is part of the problem actually. So initially, during the first week, well, chicks, they need especially heat, as you know, you need that for the brooding period. But from week 4 onwards, they don't need that much heat anymore, but they especially need to expel heat. And that is when you have heat stress. And like I said, it's not only a matter of temperature, but it's also a matter of relative humidity. And if both are high, then the broiler will suffer quite a bit. You'll see that with the respiration is with open beak. You see that there is a rapid up and down movement of the throat, like I mentioned, that is panting. You also see that they are raising feathers and the wings out from the body. And you see that they try to find a cooler place with the chest. And on the chest there are hardly any feathers. Usually with broilers, they're going to lay on the cooler floor. Of course, if the floor is not cool, if it is wet, if it is moist because of red litter, for instance, then it will not have any effect. But they try to get rid of the heat as much as possible. Now, heat stress is what to do about it. Well, you could say I'm going to feed especially during the day when the temperature and humidity is lower. On the other hand, with broilers you don't really have a choice because you want to feed them as much as possible anyhow. But at least you can try to feed them early morning or late afternoon or late evening, and during the night. That is when the best moment, when the temperature and humidity is lower, supposedly. Depending on the climate, of course, and that would be a good moment to feed them more quantity. Do realize that when the bird is actively losing heat and really losing heat by the respiratory system really is an active process, then less blood is available for the guts, and as such, if it takes a long time, it may even damage the gut. And like I said in the previous presentation, you may find some orange, pink droppings also because of this problem. And if there's less feed in the gut, there is less oxygen required to digest that feed, and also you have less heat produced. So it's a bit of a contradiction. We would like our broilers to grow fast, of course, but then under hot conditions, they will also suffer if we feed them, if they eat a lot, and at the same time there's a difficult climate. That is a bit contradicting, unfortunately. The good news is that broilers, to some extent, can get used to heat. Sudden increases in heat, suddenly a hot day, suddenly a hot afternoon, that is much more problematic. Now, you could give some additives to the feed, and two of them mentioned here are quite effective. You could give them a vitamin C, which helps a lot to encourage the production of hormones against stress, and then about 300 to 500 grams per 1,000 liters of drinking water would be good, or you can even start with 100 grams per 1,000 liters if you want to start a day before a hot period. And extra electrolytes might also help, especially to counteract body acidification and to supplement necessary electrolytes. And then you could add up to 0.3 potassium chloride to the drinking water, or to follow the product instructions if that comes with the potassium chloride. Now here you see that, like I said, it's not just the high temperature, but it's the high temperature and the high humidity. And that is the problem here. I'll show you another slide which is maybe easier for you. Now here you see that, and you probably experienced that in Bangladesh also, that it's not just the high temperature, but the high humidity in combination with the high temperature. That is when the chicken is really suffering, of course. Now, what you can do as far as climate is concerned, as far as is to have a poultry unit, which is a closed unit, and then you can have a chilling effect. And in this case, you realize that by making a strong air movement up to 2 meters or maybe 3 meters per second or even higher. And that movement over the chickens, that fast moving air, has a wind chill effect. And in this case, I have a picture, and that it mentioned that the wind chill effect is as much as 6 degrees. Now, apart from that tunnel ventilation, in this picture, there's another thing going on, and that is this evaporative cooling. It's that is evaporative cooling, sorry. So here we have, for instance, an example is we have here hot outside air at a temperature of about 35 degrees, and then passing through this moist evaporative cooling system, the air enters, and then it is about 7 degrees cooler. So the actual temperature of the air here is 35 degrees, here it is 7 degrees cooler, so the temperature here is 28 degrees. But apart from that, I also have, because of this fast blowing wind, this wind chill effect, another 6 degrees less. So in fact, instead of the birds, they feel outside the bird, the temperature is 35 degrees, but for the chickens, it feels like it's just 22 degrees. So that is a very nice system, very nice system. Expensive though, but it's a nice system to cool down broilers. Unfortunately, it's not effective everywhere. And I want to show you this here. And that is that you can imagine let me first go back to the first one. You can imagine that the water is being cooled with water. So this air is drier and this air is wetter. But if the air coming into this unit has a higher humidity, you can imagine that the chickens are going to lose heat by evaporation. And for evaporation, the most effective evaporation is when the air around it is dry. So when the air is too wet, the chickens cannot evaporate water by means of panting. So if the humidity is too high, then also panting will not be effective, and then birds will suffer a lot. And what we're doing here is, in fact, we are bringing moist air into the poultry unit. And if that moist air is more than 70%, so if the air inside the unit is more than 70% relative humidity, then the birds will suffer even more. So that is the case. That is what I want to show in this next picture. Here we see a line. This brown line indicates the humidity during the day. So you see here, this is from 1 a.m. up to 12 p.m. And then during the night, the relative humidity is getting higher. And then during the day, of course, this is just one case, but in general, during the day, the relative humidity drops. And then in the afternoon, when the temperature is going down, the relative humidity goes up again. And for the temperature, we see here that during the early morning, the temperature drops from 1 a.m. to 6 o'clock in the morning when the sun is rising to only 18 degrees. And then gradually during the day, the temperature goes up to 32, 33 degrees. And then after 2 o'clock, gradually the temperature drops again to about 22 degrees at midnight. Now, I said that we cannot use this evaporative cooling system when the humidity is higher than 70%. So basically, we can use the relative humidity, we can use the evaporative cooling system only from 8 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That is the period during which we can use evaporative cooling. So at night, it should be switched off because the birds will suffer even more. You can still use the wind chill effect, but you should not use the evaporative cooling system anymore. Now, then in week 5, birds are getting heavier, and then we have problems with leg quality. Although you might find those problems with leg quality before already also. The thing is, the floor space is filled up, the litter space, the litter quality is getting worse, and that increases the risk of leg quality problems. And the problem is that if broilers have leg problems, they walk with pain. So that means that they don't like to walk too much. So they eat less, they drink less, and they perform less. So, and you get relatively a higher feed conversion rate also. So you don't want this to happen, of course. So keep the litter dry, because that is quite an obvious reason. There are, of course, other reasons, but dry litter is very important to prevent hard cakes in the litter. Yeah. Usually the density is quite high, and you want to keep that litter dry. Wet litter, like will cause ammonia and uric acid, that will also deteriorate the air composition. Now, this is what happens when you have wet litter. when you have wet litter, and then that will compromise the leg quality. That could be because of poor diet. It could be because of poor ventilation. That could also be because of diseases like kidney disorders. Then chickens are going to drink far too much, actually. A high relative humidity, digestive disorders, excessive broiler density, or poor water pipe management. All these contribute to wet litter, and if the litter is wet, they contribute to a poor leg quality. In Europe, we're quite strict on animal welfare, but in that respect, the birds which are processed in the slaughterhouse are also checked for lesions. And this is not only relevant for the welfare of the birds, but it's also important for the welfare of you as poultry farmers, because you can imagine that birds which have a severe discoloration, severe ulcer like this, or a bumblefoot like here, these chickens are walking with in great pain. And if they walk in pain, like I said before, they don't eat enough, they don't drink enough, and they perform much less. So better check this frequently to see if you have any problems, and learn from this and try to prevent it for the next batch, because it is at this stage, once the birds are 5 weeks old and you find these problems, there's not much you can do about it anymore. Some recommended actions would be then to check the litter quality at different locations in the broiler house. Make sure that the broilers are using the house evenly, so that you can check frequently where are the birds, are there special places where they avoid to sit. Check on that and improve wherever possible. And prevent dark spots due to poor distribution of light bulbs or broken lights. Yeah, you will hardly notice yourself maybe, but chickens can see much better than we can, and therefore they will respond to broken lights also. And if you have fluorescent light, prevent excessive bright spots. They're not in favor of that too much. And monitor, like I said in the previous presentation, you should monitor the droppings daily. If the droppings are wet, find the cause and act accordingly. And if you have a water meter, it can be quite useful also to detect the water consumption, and to find out early if there is a blockage or there is a leakage in the water, and adjust the drinker so that the birds will not spill too much water, of course. Remove wet litter if possible, but that if it is possible, then it will help quite a bit. Although if you don't tackle the source of the wet litter, then of course it will become wet immediately afterwards. And to prevent the caking, getting the tough layer on the chicken. Do realize that a chicken of 2 kilograms may have been drinking as much as 6.5 liters of water. And 5 liters of those 6.5 liters will be excreted. So you will have, if you have 1,000 birds, 1,000 broilers of 2 kilograms, then you have 5,000 liters of water, excess water in your unit also. That should be evaporated, should be absorbed, whatever the case. But be aware that a lot of water is entering the unit and will not stay in the body of the chicken. Now here you see some also breast blisters. You might see them. They become red, and sometimes you can actually see the blisters themselves. And that could be a consequence of poor litter also. Acid burns and dampness together with damp heat can be really a problem. Especially because the breast area, that is an expensive piece of meat, so that might also compromise. You might also suffer from a lower price because of the poor quality of the fillets here. Now, in general, there's a picture here. If your broilers are dirty, then also your litter is dirty. So that's an early indication as to what might be going on here. So good litter is loose, and therefore causes less softening and irritation of the foot pad. And poor litter has a dry matter content of less than 40%. Now, I don't recommend you to check do a lab test to see how much humidity content your litter has, but it could be worthwhile to really check if your litter is dry and keep it dry until the end of production. Now, for litter material, there are quite a few possibilities. In Europe, we mainly use wood shavings, not to be mistaken from wood sawdust. Wood shavings is a lot coarser and sawdust is very fine. This is a suitable material. I can imagine that in Bangladesh you will have plenty of rice, and then you can use rice husks, which is also an excellent litter material. There are other materials also available with their advantages and disadvantages. And as always, you have to take care, if you're using items like straw or wheat straw, then sometimes there is a risk that there is some mold. You don't want to prevent mold to enter in your litter actually. Now, the final phase, then do realize that all mistakes you have made during the first weeks will come to surface and will be magnified even. So there is no escape if you made a mistake like I said before, if you make a mistake in the first 2 weeks, you may suffer for the rest of the time. Now, fortunately, if you have broiler production it takes only a few weeks, so you always have a second chance. But you want to, as much as possible, you want to avoid problems, of course. And at this stage, the birds, they are getting older, they are more suffering, everything becomes more difficult, the body is more difficult, the body is bigger, the eating is more, everything is more, the heat stress is more. So this is a tough time for the birds, actually. Mistakes you have made, they can't be corrected anymore. It's just something you have to deal with. The damage may be limited. You expect a fast growth rate in the last week, but unfortunately also the feed conversion rate will also increase. So you have to be careful. Make sure that if you are marketing and you have make an appointment on one day, that your bird will be collected on that day and not 2 days later. Because already, if you calculate, you'll see that it has quite a few consequences for your feed bill. Now, the feed intake needs to increase as well, and if not, your broilers may not be able to get rid of heat properly. The appetite will reduce, and the growth rate will level off. And then, if there's no more growth rate, then it's pointless to keep the broilers anymore, because then only the feed conversion rate will up. You may expect also an increase in mortality rate. Usually mortality is a bit higher during the first weeks, but also during the last weeks. So don't keep the birds too long. Realize that fast birds, they require plenty of oxygen, so you might need quite a bit of ventilation whether you have a closed unit or an open unit. And too often, the biggest broilers, they die because of this. So be aware of that. Ascites due to low temperature, but also due to a high carbon dioxide early in life may occur. And if you pick up broilers by the feet and the broiler turns blue, then you may expect some kind of ascites problems, although it could be associated with other diseases also. And heat stress is happening due to increased heat production and less space, of course. Now, then finally, we're going to do some catching and loading at the final stage. And then first, we should consider the feed withdrawal, because it reduces the risk of fecal contamination at a processing plant. In Europe, we're very strict on this. I'm not sure what the practice is in Bangladesh, of course, but feed should be removed from the flock some 6 to 12 hours before the expected time of processing. So it would be good if you know at what time the birds would be processed to be able to plan accordingly. Although not always easy to plan and mistakes are being made, you can't always know exactly when your birds are going to be processed. Make sure that water will be available continuously throughout until catching. Yeah. And feed withdrawal process must be done in a balanced way, considering bird welfare at all times, and complement the normal eating behavior of the flock also. I would advise you to allow birds to clean up all the feed in the feeders, because after all, the feed is expensive, and all the feed in the feeders which is not consumed will not be suitable again for the next flock. So make sure they eat everything you paid for. And the guts should be emptied without excessive weight loss. If you're waiting too long, then the birds will actually lose weight. Now, of course, this system depends on whether you are processing it, whether you're selling the birds per piece or per weight. And I can imagine that in some cases people like to have a full stomach because then the weight is heavier. But then do realize that slaughtering might be a bit more complicated, although maybe not of your concern. Then the catching itself, you would like to do minimize light intensity. If you have a high light intensity and you're going to catch the birds, then you might have a problem because they're not used to that much light. They become stressed and they might even die of a heart attack. Yeah, make sure that control and adjust the ventilation carefully. Also, you want to continue avoiding heat stress and catch the birds with care, avoiding injury. With two hands, one bird would be ideal. Although in practice, I can imagine that people will rather take 3 or 4 chickens in one hand, of course. Now, clear guidelines must be in place, and the catching process should be monitored and reviewed regularly. And appropriate personnel training is essential for this. And then transport, finally, maybe it's not of your concern, but it would help if they would be in suitable vehicles, which do provide adequate protection from the climate and have plenty of ventilation also. And of course, which should be within local current guidelines or legislation. And during transport, use ventilation, extra heating, or maybe even extra cooling when necessary and when appropriate and when possible, of course. Try to minimize stops, transport distances, and transport time, and adhere to local current guidelines and legislation. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you very much for your attention.